The sound came first a sharp cry that cut through the courtroom like broken glass. A pregnant woman lay on the cold marble floor, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other reaching out as if to shield an unborn life. Papers were scattered. A child's scream echoed from the back row. No one moved. No one breathed. A woman in designer heels stood over her chest, rising fast, eyes burning with rage and victory. A man in an expensive suit looked away. Then the gavel trembled in the judge's hand. For one brief moment, the powerful courtroom fell silent, frozen between cruelty and consequence, as the judge slowly lifted his head and stared at the woman on the floor. His face went pale. Before we enter this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe stories can still teach us justice, love, and truth, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Her name was Amara Okoye, and for 3 years, she had lived a life no one was allowed to see. To the world, Daniel Okoye was a self-made billionaire chairman of Okoye Holdings, a man whose face appeared on business magazines across West Africa. He sponsored economic forums in Abuja, owned oil logistics in Port Harcourt, and spoke confidently about family values whenever cameras were near. But Amara was never beside him in those photos. She lived in a quiet duplex on the outskirts of Enugu, far from the glass towers and flashing lights. The house was comfortable, but it was never truly a home. No visitors, no family gatherings, no framed wedding photos on the walls, only silence, long evenings, and unanswered questions. Amara had met Daniel when she was 24, working as a junior accounts clerk in one of his subsidiaries. She had been brilliant but shy, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. Daniel noticed her during a late audit review. He admired her calm intelligence. She admired his confidence, his generosity, the way he spoke about building something meaningful. When he pursued her, he did it quietly. No media, no noise, he had said gently. My life is complicated. Amara believed him. Their wedding happened in a small registry office, witnessed by only 2 lawyers and a driver who waited outside. Daniel promised her that one day, when the time was right, the world would know she was his wife. That day never came. At first, Amara told herself it didn't matter. Love, she believed, was private. She didn't need designer gowns or interviews. She only wanted honesty, warmth, and partnership. But slowly, Daniel began to disappear. Board meetings replaced dinners. International trips replaced weekends. When Amara called, he answered with rushed words. I'm busy, Amara. We'll talk later. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became silence. Then she became pregnant. Amara still remembered the day the doctor smiled and said, Congratulations, Mrs. Okoye. She had walked out of the clinic holding her scan photo with trembling hands, heart pounding with hope. This child would change everything. This baby would finally make her visible. When she told Daniel, there was a long pause on the phone. Are you sure? He asked. Yes, she replied softly. I'm very sure. Another pause, longer this time. That's good, he said eventually. We'll discuss when I get back. He never sounded excited. He never asked how she felt. And when he returned from his trip 2 weeks later, he stayed in a hotel instead of coming home. That was when Amara realized something was terribly wrong. She began to notice the signs she had ignored before: perfume on his jackets that wasn't hers, unfamiliar phone numbers calling late at night, business dinners that lasted until dawn. And then one evening, the truth found her, without mercy. She was scrolling through her phone when a photo appeared on a popular entertainment blog. Daniel Okoye, arm in arm with a woman everyone seemed to know. Vanessa Mensah, a former beauty queen turned socialite, elegant, fearless, always surrounded by cameras. The caption read, "Billionaire Daniel Okoye steps out with rumored fiancé at charity gala in Accra." Fiancé. Amara felt the room spin. Her fingers shook as she read the comments. She's perfect for him. They make such a powerful couple. Finally, he chose well. Chose. That night, Amara vomited until her throat burned, not from morning sickness, but from heartbreak. When she confronted Daniel, he didn't deny it. "Vanessa understands my world," he said calmly. "She fits." "And what about me?" Amara asked, tears streaming down her face. "What about your child?" Daniel looked away. "This isn't the time for drama." Drama. From that day, Amara's life became smaller and heavier. Her allowance was reduced. Her driver was reassigned. Calls from Daniel stopped completely. She received messages only from his lawyers asking her to remain discreet. Still, she endured. She attended antenatal appointments alone. She cooked for one and set the table for two out of habit, even though Daniel never came. At night, she spoke softly to her unborn baby. "It's just you and me now," she whispered, "but we'll survive." What Amara didn't know was that Vanessa had noticed her too. Vanessa had discovered Daniel was married when she was already deeply involved, and instead of stepping away, she chose war. To Vanessa, Amara was not a wife. She was an inconvenience, a shadow that needed to disappear. And so one morning, Amara received an official envelope. A lawsuit. She was being accused of fraud, of pretending to be Daniel's wife, of attempting to extort money using a false pregnancy. Amara read the words again and again, disbelief turning into cold fear. They were taking her to court. As she folded the papers with shaking hands, her baby kicked for the first time that day, hard as if sensing danger. Amara placed her palm on her belly and took a deep breath. If they wanted to erase her, she would stand where they least expected her, in court. Vanessa Mensah had never been told no in her life. From the moment she won her first regional beauty title, in Takoradi, doors opened effortlessly. Men admired her confidence. Women envied her elegance. The media loved her sharp tongue and fearless presence. By 30, she had reinvented herself as a businesswoman, fashion endorsements, charity galas, and carefully curated appearances beside powerful men. Daniel Okoye was not just another rich man to her. He was the crown. They met at a Pan-African investment summit in Accra. Daniel had been one of the keynote speakers. Vanessa was the special guest invited to speak briefly about women empowerment. She noticed him before he noticed her. His calm authority, the way people leaned in when he spoke. After the event, she approached him without hesitation. "You speak like a man who's tired of pretending," she said with a smile. Daniel laughed. He liked her boldness. He liked how she didn't act impressed by his money, or at least how convincingly she pretended not to be. What started as conversations became dinners. Dinners became trips. Trips became intimacy. And through it all, Daniel never mentioned a wife. When Vanessa finally discovered the truth, through a discreet background check done by her assistant, she didn't cry. She smiled. So, there is a woman, she said calmly, reading the report. Hidden, quiet, pregnant. Her assistant hesitated. Do you want me to stop digging? No, Vanessa replied. I want everything. To Vanessa, marriage was not sacred. Visibility was. She confronted Daniel that same night in his hotel suite in Lagos. You're married, she said plainly. Daniel froze for half a second. Then he sighed as if tired. It's complicated. Is she still useful to you? Vanessa asked. Daniel didn't answer. Vanessa took that silence as permission. From that moment, she decided Amara Okoye was not a woman to be respected, but a problem to be removed. Vanessa began appearing everywhere with Daniel. Charity luncheons, fundraisers, international conferences. She made sure photographers caught the right angles, the right smiles. She held his hand in public. She leaned into him when people were watching. And Daniel let her. Amara watched all of it from the quiet of her living room. Every headline felt like a slap. Billionaire couple stuns at Pan-African Gala. Power pair Daniel Okoye and Vanessa Mensah, wedding bells. Soon. One afternoon, Amara's neighbor, a kind elderly woman, knocked gently on her door. My dear, she said softly, are you okay? I saw something online. Amara smiled politely. I'm fine. But she wasn't. Her nights were filled with anxiety. Her days were heavy with shame she didn't deserve. She stopped attending church to avoid whispers. She stopped answering calls from old friends because she didn't know what to say. How do you explain that you are legally married but socially erased? Meanwhile, Vanessa escalated. She sent anonymous messages to gossip blogs. She leaked half-truths, twisted timelines, and damaging suggestions. Soon the narrative shifted. There was no secret wife. There was only a desperate woman claiming marriage. Vanessa even arranged a televised interview. Sitting elegantly on a cream sofa, legs crossed, she spoke with practiced sadness. I don't like drama, she said, looking directly into the camera. But sometimes people lie to trap successful men. Pregnancy scams are not new. The interviewer nodded sympathetically. And how does that make you feel? He asked. Vanessa sighed, concerned for Daniel's reputation and for the unborn child, if there even is one. That night, Amara cried harder than she ever had. She wasn't crying because of Vanessa. She was crying because Daniel said nothing. No denial. No defense. No call. When Amara finally reached him, her voice broke. Why are you letting her do this to me? Daniel's response was cold. You should stay out of the spotlight, he said. This will blow over. She called my baby a lie, Amara whispered. Silence. Then he said, I'll have my lawyers handle it. That was the moment Amara understood. She was alone. Vanessa, emboldened by Daniel's distance, took the final step. She filed a formal lawsuit in the High Court of Enugu State. The charges were severe: fraud, impersonation, attempted extortion. The claim stated that Amara Okoye had falsely represented herself as the lawful wife of Daniel Okoye and had manufactured a pregnancy to gain financial advantage. Vanessa requested damages and a restraining order. When the court summons arrived, Amara's knees nearly gave way. She read the papers slowly, hands shaking, the words swimming before her eyes. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. This was an attempt to destroy her completely. Her doctor warned her to avoid stress. You're already at risk, the doctor said gently. Your blood pressure is high. But Amara refused to hide. She contacted a modest but respected law firm in Enugu. The lead lawyer, barrister Chinedu Afolayan, listened quietly as she told her story. When she finished, he leaned back and said, "This will not be easy." "I know," Amara replied, "but I won't lie, and I won't run." As the court date approached, Vanessa prepared for war. She rehearsed her statements. She chose her outfits carefully: power suits, soft makeup, the image of a dignified woman protecting her future. She believed the court would favor visibility, influence, and confidence. She believed Amara would break. What she didn't consider was that pain can sometimes harden into courage. On the morning of the hearing, Amara stood in front of the mirror, one hand resting on her belly. "I don't know what will happen today," she whispered to her unborn child, "but I promise you this: no matter how small my voice is, I will use it." Outside, cameras waited. Inside the courtroom, power and pride were about to collide. And somewhere behind the elevated bench, a man in a judge's robe prepared to preside, unaware that the woman, whose name he would soon hear, carried not only a child, but a piece of his own forgotten past. The morning of the court hearing arrived with heavy clouds hanging low over Enugu, as if the sky itself sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Amara barely slept the night before. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Vanessa's face on television, heard her baby being called a lie, felt again the cold distance in Daniel's voice. By dawn, she gave up on rest and sat quietly on the edge of her bed, one hand resting on her belly, counting her breaths the way her doctor had taught her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, "for the baby." Her lawyer, barrister Chinedu Afolayan, arrived promptly at 7. He was a man in his early 50s, soft-spoken, with eyes that had seen too many injustices to be surprised by cruelty anymore. "You don't have to speak unless I ask you to," he reminded her gently as they drove toward the courthouse. "Let me do the fighting." Amara nodded, though she knew no one could truly fight this battle for her. Outside the High Court of Enugu State, a small crowd had gathered. Journalists adjusted their cameras. Curious onlookers whispered. Some recognized her from the leaked stories, the woman who claimed to be the billionaire's wife. Amara kept her head down as she walked in, but she could feel their eyes on her swollen belly, judging, speculating, doubting. Inside the courtroom, Vanessa Mensah had already arrived. She sat confidently in the front row, dressed in a tailored ivory suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture flawless. She looked calm, almost serene, like someone attending a business meeting, not a legal battle. When she saw Amara enter, a faint smile curved her lips. Not a kind one. Daniel Okoye arrived last. The room shifted when he walked in. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Power had a presence, and Daniel carried it effortlessly. His suit was dark expensive, his expression unreadable. He did not look at Amara. That hurt more than she expected. When the court clerk called the case, everyone stood. The judge entered. He was a tall man with graying hair and a stern face, known across the state for his integrity. Justice Samuel Adeyemi had built his reputation on fairness, refusing bribes, even from the most powerful figures. Lawyers respected him. Politicians feared him. Amara did not notice the slight pause in his step when he glanced at the defendant's name on the file. The proceedings began formally. Vanessa's lawyer, a sharp-tongued senior advocate from Lagos, stood first. "My lord," he began smoothly, "this case is about deception, about a woman who saw an opportunity to trap a successful man and exploited it." Vanessa lowered her gaze, playing the role of a wounded woman with dignity. The lawyer continued, "My client, Miss Vanessa Mensah, has been publicly humiliated by false claims. Claims of a secret marriage, claims of pregnancy, all fabricated to extort money and force legitimacy where none exists." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Amara's chest tightened. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and shout the truth. But she remembered Chinedu's words and stayed still. The lawyer presented screenshots, selective messages, and carefully edited timelines, pieces of a story rearranged to paint Amara as a schemer. Then Vanessa was called to testify. She stood gracefully, walked to the witness box, and placed her hand on the Bible. "I loved Daniel," she said softly, her voice steady. "I still do. And that is why I could not stay silent when I realized someone was trying to destroy him." She glanced briefly at Amara, eyes cold. "I have never met this woman before," Vanessa continued, but suddenly she appeared claiming marriage, claiming pregnancy. It felt like blackmail. "Do you believe the child is Daniel's?" the lawyer asked. Vanessa hesitated just long enough to appear conflicted. "I don't know," she said, "but there is no proof." That was when Amara felt something break inside her. Her hand trembled. Her breathing became shallow. Justice Adeyemi noticed. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze resting on Amara longer than necessary. Something about her posture, her quiet pain, stirred an unfamiliar discomfort in his chest. "Counsel for the defense," the judge said firmly. "Your turn." Barrister Chinedu stood. "My lord," he began calmly, "this case is not about rumors or reputation. It is about facts." He presented the marriage certificate, legally registered, stamped undeniable. Vanessa's confident expression flickered for the first time. Chinedu continued, "My client did not invent a marriage. She did not invent a pregnancy. She lived quietly because her husband asked her to." He turned slightly toward Daniel. "Is that not true, Mr. Okoye?" All eyes shifted to Daniel. For a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he stood. "I acknowledge the marriage," he said flatly. "But it was a private arrangement, temporary." Amara felt as if she'd been slapped. Temporary. Justice Adeyemi's jaw tightened. "And the pregnancy?" Chinedu asked. Daniel avoided Amara's eyes. "I have my doubts." A sharp gasp escaped Amara's lips before she could stop it. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge raised his gavel. "Order." Amara felt dizzy. The room spun. The baby kicked hard as if reacting to her distress. Vanessa watched satisfaction flickering across her face. Then it happened. As the session paused briefly for document verification, Vanessa leaned forward from her seat and spoke loudly enough for Amara to hear. "You should have stayed hidden," she said with a smile. "Now everyone can see what you really are." Amara stood up instinctively, her body acting before her mind could stop it. "I am his wife," she said, her voice breaking. "And this child—" "Sit down," Vanessa snapped, standing as well. "Stop lying." The judge struck the gavel. "Ms. Mensah, control yourself." But Vanessa had lost control. Fueled by anger, jealousy, and the fear of losing, she stepped forward too fast, too close. And in one shocking movement, she shoved Amara. Amara cried out as she fell backward, her body hitting the floor hard. Pain exploded through her abdomen. Screams filled the courtroom. "Call a doctor!" someone shouted. Daniel froze, his face pale. Justice Adeyemi stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His hands shook as he stared at Amara, lying there clutching her belly, eyes wide with terror. For the first time in his long judicial career, his voice trembled. "Clear this courtroom," he ordered. Now, as guards rushed forward and medics were called, the judge's eyes never left Amara. Something deep inside him, something buried for decades, was screaming that this was more than a case. Much more. The courtroom emptied in chaos. Uniformed officers formed a barrier as paramedics rushed in, lifting Amara gently onto a stretcher. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, her hands still instinctively protecting her belly. She whispered something no one else could hear over and over again, words meant only for the life inside her. "Please, hold on, please." Daniel stood, frozen, where he was, shock draining the color from his face. For the first time since the trial began, fear pierced through his carefully controlled composure. He took one step forward, then stopped unsure, as if he no longer knew what role he was supposed to play. Vanessa, on the other hand, was being restrained by court officers. "I didn't mean to," she protested, her voice sharp with panic. "She provoked me." But no one was listening anymore. Justice Samuel Adeyemi remained standing behind the bench long after the stretcher disappeared through the doors. His gavel lay untouched. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Court is adjourned," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "This session will not resume today." The words were procedural, but his heart was anything but calm. As the room cleared, the judge sank slowly back into his chair. The image of Amara on the floor replayed in his mind again and again, the way she had fallen, the way she had cried out, the way she had looked up at him. That look. It had struck him like a blow to the chest. Not because he felt pity. He had seen suffering before. Decades on the bench had hardened him to tears and tragedy. This was different. There was something hauntingly familiar about her eyes. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Tests were ordered. Monitors beeped steadily as Amara lay on the bed, fighting waves of pain and fear. Barrister Chinedu stood nearby, his face drawn with worry. "The baby's heartbeat is still strong," the doctor said, after what felt like an eternity. "But she needs rest. No more stress. Any further shock could be dangerous." Amara nodded. Weakly, tears slipping silently down her temples. "Can I see the judge?" Chinedu asked, hesitantly. The doctor frowned. "The judge. He requested to be informed." Chinedu replied. Minutes later, Justice Adeyemi arrived quietly, without escort, without ceremony. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back, his robe replaced by a simple dark suit. Amara opened her eyes and saw him. For a brief second, confusion crossed her face. Then recognition, not of who he was, but of the authority he carried. "My lord," she whispered, trying to sit up. "Please," he said quickly, raising a hand. "Don't move." His voice was gentle now, almost too gentle. He looked at the monitor, at the steady rhythm of the heartbeat, and felt his throat tighten. "You were very brave today," he said quietly. Amara swallowed. "I didn't plan to be," she replied. I just didn't want to lie. Justice Adeyemi nodded slowly. Rest, he said. The court will ensure your safety. As he turned to leave, Amara spoke again. My lord. He paused. I don't want revenge, she said softly. I just want my child to grow up knowing the truth. Those words followed him long after he left the room. That night, Justice Adeyemi could not sleep. He sat alone in his study, the walls lined with law books and old case files, the air thick with memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been that way for years. On his desk lay a faded photograph. A younger version of himself stood beside a teenage girl with bright eyes and a stubborn tilt to her chin. She was smiling then, laughing even. His daughter, Aisha Adeyemi. She had been brilliant, strong-willed, determined to live life on her own terms. They had argued often about her choices, her refusal to follow the path he laid out for her. Their final argument had been the worst. She had accused him of caring more about his reputation than her happiness. He had accused her of being reckless. She left that night and never came back. Years later, he received word that she had died during childbirth in a private clinic far from home. The child did not survive either, or so he was told. Justice Adeyemi had buried his grief beneath layers of duty and discipline. He had told himself that regret was a luxury he could not afford. But tonight, something had cracked. Amara's voice, her eyes, her quiet strength, and her name. Amara Okoye. He had read it on the file, spoken it aloud in court, and yet it echoed in his mind in a way names never did. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved an old envelope yellowed with age. Inside were documents he had not looked at in years. Hospital records, correspondence, unanswered letters. One document caught his eye, a birth record. The mother's name was partially obscured, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His late wife's. His heart pounded. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly short of breath. No, he whispered. That's not possible. And yet, doubt crept in. The timing, the age, the resemblance. Justice Adeyemi closed his eyes. If Amara was who his heart feared she might be, then today's trial was not just a test of law. It was a reckoning. Back at the hospital, Amara slept fitfully, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Outside her room, Daniel stood alone in the corridor, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his choices. He had tried to control the narrative, to manage appearances, to avoid discomfort. And now, everything was slipping through his fingers. Vanessa sat in a separate room under guard. Her confidence shattered, her mind racing with consequences she had never imagined facing. And somewhere between guilt, fear, and awakening truth, the silent judge prepared himself. Because when court resumed, it would no longer be just about wealth or lies. It would be about justice, and about a truth that had waited far too long to be seen. The court resumed 3 days later, under an atmosphere so tense it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. News of the courtroom assault had spread quickly across Enugu, then beyond. First whispered in offices and markets, then splashed across radio discussions and online forums. Public opinion was divided, but one thing was certain. The case was no longer a private dispute. It had become a moral reckoning. Amara returned to court slowly, carefully, escorted by medical staff and her lawyer. Her movements were cautious now. The baby was stable, but her body still carried the memory of the fall. Every step reminded her how fragile life could be. She wore a simple maternity dress, no jewelry, no makeup, beyond what was necessary to look presentable. Her strength was not in how she looked, but in the fact that she came back at all. When she entered, conversations hushed. Some eyes held pity, others shame. Daniel was already seated, his usual confidence replaced by something brittle and uncertain. He watched Amara this time, not with love, but with a dawning realization that things had gone too far. Vanessa was brought in under supervision. Gone was the serene elegance. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. She avoided looking at anyone, especially the judge. The reality of criminal charges for assault loomed heavily over her when Justice Samuel Adeyemi entered the courtroom. Rose. He took his seat slowly. His expression was composed, but those closest to the bench noticed the subtle difference. His eyes were sharper now, more focused, as if something inside him had been awakened. This court, he began, his voice steady, will proceed with this case under strict order. Any further misconduct will be met with immediate consequences. His gaze rested briefly on Vanessa. She lowered her head. Barrister Chinedu rose first. "My lord," he said, "before we continue, the defense would like to formally submit medical reports confirming both the pregnancy and the trauma sustained during the previous session." He handed the documents forward. Justice Adeyemi read them carefully. Then he looked up. "Ms. Okoye," he said gently, "are you physically able to continue?" Amara nodded. "Yes, my lord." Her voice was soft, but it did not tremble. Vanessa's lawyer stood next, clearing his throat. "My lord, while my client deeply regrets the incident, we maintain that emotions were heightened due to provocation." "Objection." Chinedu cut in sharply. "There is no justification for violence, especially against a pregnant woman." Justice Adeyemi raised a hand. "There will be no attempt to excuse assault in this court," he said firmly. "Proceed with the facts." A ripple of approval moved through the gallery. Daniel was then called to testify. As he walked to the stand, something inside him resisted. He had built his life on control, controlling narratives, controlling people, controlling outcomes. But now, standing under oath, he felt exposed. "Mr. Okoye, the judge, began, you acknowledge that Ms. Amara Okoye is your lawful wife?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "And that the marriage was conducted legally?" "Yes." "Why, then," the judge asked, "did you allow public narratives to deny her existence?" Daniel hesitated. "Because my public image matters," he said finally. "My business depends on stability." A murmur spread across the room. Justice Adeyemi's eyes hardened. "And your child?" he asked. "Does that not matter?" Daniel swallowed. "I was unsure." "Unsure," the judge repeated quietly. "Despite medical confirmation." Daniel said nothing. Chinedu stepped forward. "Mr. Okoye," he said, "did you instruct your legal team to reduce your wife's support during her pregnancy?" Daniel nodded reluctantly. "Yes." "Did you instruct them to discourage her from appearing publicly?" "Yet." Did you ever deny to Ms. Mensah that you were married? Daniel's silence answered the question. Vanessa clenched her fists. The image she had built of herself as the deceived woman was cracking. Then came the turning point. Chinedu submitted phone records, messages, voicemails, clear evidence that Daniel had reassured Vanessa repeatedly that the situation would be handled. Handled. Justice Adeyemi leaned back slightly, his face unreadable. Mr. Okoye, he said, do you understand that your silence empowered violence? Daniel's head dropped. Yes, he whispered. Amara closed her eyes. It was not satisfaction she felt, only sadness. The court then turned to Vanessa. She stood slowly, her confidence visibly shaken. Ms. Mensah, the judge, said you are an educated woman. Influential. You had options. Vanessa lifted her chin. I was protecting myself. By assaulting a pregnant woman, the judge asked. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes, not of remorse, but fear. I loved him, she said desperately. I believed him. Justice Adeyemi's voice softened, but only slightly. Love does not excuse cruelty, he said, and belief does not erase responsibility. As the session drew to a close, something shifted in the room. The power balance was no longer dictated by wealth or fame. It was dictated by truth. Amara felt it. For the first time since her marriage began to unravel, she felt seen not as a problem, not as a rumor, but as a human being. As court adjourned for the day, Justice Adeyemi remained seated, long after everyone else had stood. His eyes followed Amara as she exited. His heart was heavy. The doubt that had entered his mind days earlier was no longer faint. It was loud, because every word she spoke, every quiet act of courage, echoed something he had lost long ago. And if his fear was true, then justice this time would demand more than the law. It would demand truth. By the seventh day of proceedings, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a battlefield. Outside the High Court of Enugu State, crowds gathered every morning. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger. Many out of personal pain they saw reflected in Amara's story. Women stood quietly with folded arms. Men argued in low voices. Radio hosts debated morality and power late into the night. Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick in the air. Amara sat upright, though her back ached and her legs swelled easily now. She had learned how to breathe through discomfort, how to swallow fear before it reached her throat. Every movement of her baby reminded her why she had to stay strong. Vanessa sat across from her, rigid and defensive. She had slept poorly for days. The confident smiles were gone, replaced by sharp glances and clenched jaws. The reality that public sympathy was slipping away from her gnawed at her pride. She was no longer the admired woman protecting her future. She was becoming the villain. When the session resumed, Vanessa's lawyer requested permission for his client to address the court directly. Justice Adeyemi hesitated briefly, then nodded. You may speak, he said, but choose your words carefully. Vanessa stood. She smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin, and looked around the courtroom as if drawing strength from being seen. My lord, she began, I have been portrayed as a monster in this case, but I am a woman who was lied to, a woman who invested her time, her reputation, and her heart. She paused, then turned toward Amara, and I refuse to apologize for defending myself. A murmur spread through the gallery. Vanessa continued, her voice gaining sharpness. This woman, she said, pointing at Amara, appeared suddenly with a story that conveniently placed her above everyone else. She claims marriage. She claims motherhood. But where was she all these years? Amara's heart thudded painfully. Vanessa took a step forward, ignoring her lawyer's warning glance. She hid, Vanessa said, because she knew she didn't belong in Daniel's world. Gasps echoed. Justice Adeyemi's eyes narrowed. Vanessa pressed on, fueled by bitterness. Look at her, she said coldly. She wants us to believe she was chosen, but chosen women are not hidden. They are celebrated. Amara's hands began to shake. The baby shifted restlessly. Barrister Chinedu stood up immediately. My lord, this line of speech is abusive. But Vanessa was no longer listening. And that child, she added sharply, has become her shield, her excuse, her weapon. That was when Amara broke. She stood slowly, one hand gripping the edge of the bench for balance. My lord, she said, her voice trembling but clear, I did not hide because I was ashamed. Vanessa scoffed loudly. I hid. Amara continued because my husband asked me to, because I trusted him, because I believed love didn't need applause. Her eyes met Vanessa's, and my child is not a weapon, she said softly. He is my heart. Silence fell. Vanessa laughed, a short, cruel sound. Don't pretend you're innocent, she snapped. Women like you know exactly what you're doing. Justice Adeyemi struck the gavel. Ms. Mensah. He warned, his voice firm. This court will not tolerate personal attacks, but the damage had already been done. Amara's breathing became uneven. Her vision blurred slightly. She could feel the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest, not just as a woman, but as a mother. She lowered herself back into her seat, slowly fighting tears. Justice Adeyemi watched her closely. Something in his chest twisted painfully. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen entitlement, cruelty, and pride dressed up as confidence. But seeing it directed so mercilessly at a pregnant woman stirred something deeper, something personal. Vanessa, however, was not finished. My lord, she said defiantly, I have been patient, but I will not sit quietly while someone destroys my future. She turned again toward Amara, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that still carried across the room. You should have known your place. That sentence echoed louder than any shout. The courtroom erupted. Shame, someone yelled from the back. That's enough, another voice cried. Justice Adeyemi rose to his feet. Order, he commanded. His face was stern, but his eyes burned with restrained fury. This court recognizes dignity, he said, and today it has been repeatedly violated. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond. Sit down, the judge said sharply. She froze. Slowly, she obeyed. Amara felt a tear slip down her cheek, not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. Years of silence. Years of erasure. Years of being treated as invisible. Justice Adeyemi allowed a brief recess. As people stood, Amara remained seated, her head bowed. The judge watched her for a long moment. He remembered another young woman, his daughter, standing in his living room years ago, voice-shaking eyes, burning with the same quiet pain. You never listened to me, Aisha had said then. You only hear what fits your world. He had dismissed her words, and he had paid for it every day since. When court resumed, Justice Adeyemi spoke slowly, deliberately. This court will proceed with evidence, he said, not insults, not pride. He turned to Vanessa. You will be given opportunity to defend yourself with facts, he said. But understand, this character assassination is not a legal argument. Vanessa nodded stiffly, her confidence visibly shaken. Amara exhaled shakily. For the first time, someone in power had drawn a clear line. As the day ended, Amara was escorted out quietly. People parted to let her pass. Some lowered their eyes, others nodded respectfully. She did not look back. Justice Adeyemi remained seated again long after the courtroom emptied. The echo of Vanessa's words, "You should have known your place," rang in his ears. And in that echo, he felt something settle into painful clarity. This case was no longer just about justice between two women and a powerful man. It was about what happens when society decides who deserves dignity and who does not. And he knew deep in his bones that the next phase of this trial would change everything. The courtroom never fully recovered from what had already happened. But on the 8th day, the consequences of that violence finally took center stage. What had once been whispered was now spoken aloud. Vanessa Mensah was no longer just a complainant in a civil case. She was now facing criminal charges for assault. The atmosphere that morning was different, heavier, colder. There were more uniformed officers present, more legal observers, fewer curious onlookers. The spectacle had given way to something more serious. Accountability. Amara arrived quietly, escorted as usual. Her body was still healing, but her spirit had grown firmer. The baby had been restless the night before, responding to her emotions, but she had learned to breathe through fear and anchor herself in calm. Daniel avoided her gaze. He sat alone now, not beside Vanessa, not beside Amara. Alone exactly where his choices had led him. Vanessa entered last, flanked by her lawyer and two officers. The confidence that once defined her walk had vanished. Her shoulders were stiff, her face drawn. For the first time, the room did not part for her. People watched her the way they watch someone fall from a height, curious, cautious, and unafraid. Justice Samuel Adeyemi took his seat, his presence commanding immediate silence. This court will address the matter of physical assault that occurred during proceedings, he said calmly. Ms. Mensah, you are aware of the seriousness of this charge. Yes, my lord, Vanessa replied stiffly. The prosecution presented medical reports in full detail, bruising, abdominal trauma, stress-induced complications. The words were clinical, but the meaning behind them was brutal. A pregnant woman had been pushed to the floor in a place meant to protect her. Vanessa's lawyer attempted damage control. My lord, he said, my client acted under extreme emotional distress. She was provoked repeatedly. Justice Adeyemi lifted a hand. Provocation does not excuse violence, he said firmly, especially not against a vulnerable individual. He turned toward Amara. Ms. Okoye, he said gently, do you wish to address the court regarding the incident? Amara stood slowly. Every eye followed her. She took a deep breath before speaking. My lord, she began, I did not come to court to fight anyone. I came to tell the truth. She paused, steadying herself. When I was pushed, I was not thinking about humiliation or pride. I was thinking about my child. I thought I was going to lose him. Her voice cracked, but she continued. No matter how angry someone is, no one has the right to endanger another life. The courtroom was silent. Vanessa looked down. For the first time since the case began, her eyes filled with tears, not because of public shame, but because the weight of her actions was finally undeniable. Justice Adeyemi nodded slowly. "This court recognizes your restraint," he said to Amara. Then he turned back to Vanessa. "Ms. Mensah," he said, his tone unwavering. "Your actions crossed a line, and lines crossed in this courtroom do not disappear." Vanessa's lawyer whispered urgently to her. She swallowed hard. "My lord," Vanessa said quietly, "I lost control. I regret it." "Regret," the judge replied, "is only meaningful when followed by responsibility." He announced that Vanessa would remain under court supervision, pending sentencing for the assault separate from the civil matter. A gasp rippled through the room. Vanessa's knees weakened slightly as she returned to her seat. Daniel stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. He could no longer pretend this was someone else's problem. The court then moved to examine the pattern of manipulation that led to the violence. Messages were displayed, texts where Vanessa expressed fear of being replaced, emails where Daniel assured her he would fix the situation, voice notes filled with frustration, jealousy, and entitlement. Piece by piece, the illusion of romance crumbled. What remained was a story of power abused, truth hidden, and silence weaponized. Justice Adeyemi listened carefully. At one point, he closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in recognition. He had seen this pattern before. Not in court, in his own home. The avoidance, the emotional distance, the refusal to take responsibility until damage was done. He opened his eyes and fixed them on Daniel. "Mr. Okoye," he said, "your behavior fostered an environment where this violence became possible." Daniel stood, his voice hoarse. "I never wanted this," he said. "But you allowed it," the judge replied. "An allowance is not neutrality." Daniel had no answer. As the day wore on, the narrative became clear. Vanessa's anger had not come from nowhere. It had been fed, encouraged, left unchecked, and Amara had paid the price. When court adjourned, Amara felt exhausted, but lighter. Not because justice had been completed, but because the truth was finally being spoken without interruption. Outside, as she was escorted to her car, a woman stepped forward hesitantly. She was older, her face lined with hardship. "Madam," she said softly to Amara. "Thank you." Amara looked at her surprised. For standing up, the woman continued, "Some of us never could." Amara smiled gently. "I didn't plan to be brave," she said. "I just didn't want my child to inherit silence." From the courthouse steps, Justice Adeyemi watched her leave. The conviction in her words struck something deep inside him. Because silence had cost him a daughter once, and he would not let it cost another woman her dignity. As he returned to his chambers, he knew the next phase of this case would go beyond legal consequences. It would expose truths long buried, and when that happened, no one, not even himself, would remain unchanged. That night, after the courthouse had emptied and the city of Enugu settled into uneasy sleep, Justice Samuel Adeyemi sat alone in his chambers long past midnight. The lamps were dim. The files from the Okoye case lay open on his desk, untouched for hours. His eyes were not reading words anymore. They were tracing memories. Amara Okoye, her voice, her restraint, the way she spoke of truth without bitterness. It disturbed him in ways he could no longer ignore. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had not called in years. "Dr. Bello," he said quietly when the line connected. "I need to ask you something, unofficially." There was a pause on the other end. "Go ahead, my lord." Years ago, Justice Adeyemi said, choosing his words carefully, there was a childbirth case at St. Luke's private clinic. A young woman. Complications. Records were incomplete. Another pause. Longer this time. I remember the doctor replied slowly. "Why do you ask?" The judge swallowed. Is it possible, he asked, that a child believed lost, survived silence? Then the doctor spoke, his voice lower now. "It's possible," he said. But that case was unusual. There were instructions, pressure. Justice Adeyemi closed his eyes. Pressure. That word echoed painfully. "Can you meet me tomorrow?" the judge asked. "Yes," the doctor replied. "But be prepared for what you may hear." When the call ended, Justice Adeyemi leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. If his suspicion was true, then Amara was not just a woman seeking justice. She was family. And that truth, if confirmed, would shake the foundation of everything he believed about his past. The next morning, Amara woke with a dull ache in her lower back. The baby kicked gently, reminding her that life continued even when the world felt heavy. Barrister Chinedu had advised her to rest, but she insisted on reviewing the next day's proceedings. "I don't want to be surprised anymore," she said softly. As she sat by the window, sunlight spilling across the room, her mind drifted to her childhood fragmented memories she rarely shared. She remembered a man with a deep voice arguing with her mother in a house filled with books. She remembered a woman crying quietly at night. She remembered leaving, suddenly changing names, moving cities. Her mother had never spoken much about the past. Some doors, she used to say, are closed to protect us. Amara had believed her. But now, sitting at the center of a storm she never sought, those old memories stirred uneasily. At the courthouse, Daniel Okoye met with his legal team in private. "This is spiraling," one lawyer warned. "Your silence is no longer defensible." Daniel rubbed his temples. "I didn't think it would get this far," he muttered. "You allowed two lives to collide without honesty," another lawyer said sharply. This was inevitable. Daniel exhaled heavily. For the first time, the idea that he might lose everything, his company, his reputation, even his child, felt real. And it terrified him. When court resumed, Justice Adeyemi entered with his usual composure, but inside he was unraveling. He listened carefully as the prosecution laid out the next phase: financial trails, property transfers, attempts to quietly isolate Amara. But his mind kept drifting. To St. Luke's clinic. To a young woman he had failed. To a child he had mourned without ever seeing a grave. Then something unexpected happened. Barrister Chinedu requested permission to submit personal testimony from Amara. Justice Adeyemi hesitated only briefly. "Proceed," he said. Amara stood. "My lord," she began, "I want to speak not as a wife or a defendant, but as a person." She took a breath. "I grew up believing I had no father," she said, "or rather that the man who was supposed to be my father chose not to be in my life." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. "I don't say this to gain sympathy," she continued. "I say it because silence has followed me my entire life. And today, silence is what put me on that floor." Justice Adeyemi's chest tightened. Amara went on. My mother raised me to value truth even when it hurts. She taught me that dignity is not given, it is claimed. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. I am here because I refuse to teach my child that hiding is survival. The courtroom was utterly still. Justice Adeyemi could barely breathe. Her words struck too close, too deep. When she finished, he nodded slowly. Thank you, Ms. Okoye, he said, his voice controlled. You may sit. As the session adjourned, Justice Adeyemi returned to his chambers, where Dr. Bello was already waiting. The doctor's face was grave. I reviewed the old files, he said quietly. There was a baby. The judge's hands trembled slightly. A girl. The doctor continued. Born alive. The mother was told there were complications, but arrangements were made. Justice Adeyemi felt the room spin. Arrangements, he whispered. There were powerful people involved, the doctor said. They believed the child would ruin reputations. The judge's voice broke. What happened to her? The doctor hesitated. She was taken, he said, given a new identity. Justice Adeyemi closed his eyes. The truth crashed down on him with unbearable force. His daughter had lived. She had grown up without him. And now she stood in his courtroom carrying a child of her own, fighting for dignity in a world that had already failed her once. When he opened his eyes, they burned with resolve. This was no longer just a trial, it was redemption, and he would not fail her again. Justice Samuel Adeyemi did not sleep that night. The truth he had uncovered sat heavy in his chest, pressing against memories he had locked away for decades. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amara standing in the witness box, calm, wounded, unbroken. He heard her voice echoing through the courtroom, speaking of silence as if it were a curse passed down through generations. At dawn, he rose dressed and stood before the mirror longer than usual. I am your father, he whispered to the empty room, to the reflection that stared back at him with regret-filled eyes. The words felt unreal, terrifying, and yet inevitable. By the time court resumed that morning, Justice Adeyemi had made a decision, but it was not one he would take lightly. The courtroom filled once more. Journalists leaned forward. Lawyers adjusted files. The tension was sharper now, edged with anticipation. Something was coming, everyone could feel it. Amara entered slowly, supported by Barrister Chinedu. She looked tattered, but there was a quiet steadiness in her posture. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, as if drawing strength from the life inside her. Daniel avoided looking at her. Vanessa, seated under supervision, stared straight ahead. Her face was rigid emotion, sealed behind a mask of fear and pride. She had begun to understand that this case was slipping beyond her control. Justice Adeyemi took his seat. For a brief moment, his eyes met Amara's. Neither spoke. Neither smiled. But something unspoken passed between them, an invisible thread, tightening with every second. This court, the judge began, slowly has examined evidence of marriage misconduct, manipulation, and violence. His voice was steady, but those who knew him well could hear the weight beneath it. It has also become clear, he continued, that this case is not merely legal. A murmur spread through the room. Amara's heart began to race. What is at stake here, Justice Adeyemi said, is dignity. And dignity does not belong to the powerful alone. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before returning to Amara. "Ms. Okoye," he said gently, "your testimony revealed a life shaped by absence, by unanswered questions." Amara swallowed. "Yes, my lord." Justice Adeyemi took a breath. "There are moments," he said, "when the law forces us to confront not only others, but ourselves." The courtroom went still. Daniel frowned slightly. Vanessa shifted uneasily in her seat. Justice Adeyemi's hands trembled as he placed them on the bench. "I must disclose," he said carefully, "that information has come to my attention. Information that raises serious questions about identity and history." Barrister Chinedu stiffened. "My lord," he said cautiously, "are you suggesting I am suggesting?" The judge interrupted softly that I may have a personal connection to this matter. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Amara's breath caught. Justice Adeyemi stood. The room rose with him, but he gestured for everyone to remain seated. "Miss Amara Okoye," he said, his voice tight but clear, "I believe you may be my daughter." Time seemed to stop. Amara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping, disbelief spreading like wildfire. "What? That's impossible." Did he say? Daniel's face drained of color. Vanessa's eyes widened in shock. Justice Adeyemi raised his hand. "Order," he commanded. "Order." Slowly, silence returned. Amara's hands trembled uncontrollably. "My lord," she whispered, "what are you saying?" Justice Adeyemi's voice softened. "Many years ago, he said, I lost my daughter, or so I was told. Records were altered. Truth was buried." He looked directly at Amara. "And now, standing before me is a woman whose age, history, and spirit match the child I mourned." Tears filled Amara's eyes. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Some doors are closed to protect us." The courtroom clerk stood frozen. Barrister Chinedu looked between Amara and the judge, stunned. Justice Adeyemi continued. "Because of this revelation," he said firmly, "I will recuse myself from further judgment in this case." A gasp swept through the room. "But before I do," he added, his voice growing stronger, "I want the record to reflect something clearly." He turned toward Daniel. "You abandoned responsibility," he said coldly. "You hid behind wealth and silence while harm grew unchecked." Daniel lowered his head. Then the judge turned to Vanessa. "You allowed entitlement to become cruelty," he said, "and you will answer for it." Finally, he looked back at Amara. "And you," he said softly, "stood in truth when it would have been easier to disappear." Tears streamed down Amara's face now. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by emotion she had never allowed herself to imagine. Justice Adeyemi removed his glasses, his voice breaking. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for every year you lived without answers." Amara stood slowly, her legs weak. "My whole life," she said, through tears, "I wondered why I felt unfinished." The courtroom was silent. Justice Adeyemi nodded, his eyes glistening. "This court is adjourned," he said finally, "pending reassignment." As people slowly stood, unsure how to move forward after such a revelation, Amara remained where she was, frozen between past and present. Justice Adeyemi stepped down from the bench, no longer just a judge. He walked toward her, stopping a few steps away, careful, respectful. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said softly, "but I hope for a chance." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Not forgiveness, but possibility. And in that moment, the courtroom, once a place of judgment, became the beginning of healing. The courtroom did not feel the same after the revelation. Justice Samuel Adeyemi's departure left a vacuum that words could not fill. What had once been a legal battleground now felt like sacred ground touched by truth, regret, and a history no one had expected to witness. Court proceedings were temporarily suspended while a new judge was appointed. Outside reporters swarmed the steps of the courthouse, voices, overlapping headlines forming in real time. Shocking twist: judge reveals defendant is his daughter. Justice steps down. After emotional courtroom revelation. But inside the hospital room where Amara now rested, none of that noise mattered. She sat quietly on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Barrister Chinedu stood nearby, unsure of what to say. He had argued many cases seen injustice, even cruelty, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Do you want me to make a statement on your behalf?" he asked gently. Amara shook her head. "I need time," she said. "My whole life just changed." Her phone buzzed constantly, unknown numbers, media requests, messages from people she barely remembered. She ignored them all. The only call she answered came that evening. It was from Samuel Adeyemi. "Amara," he said softly. "Not Miss Okoye, not the defendant, just her name." She closed her eyes. "Yes, I wanted you to hear this from me, not the world," he continued. "I have ordered a full independent DNA test. Whatever the result, I will respect your boundaries." There was sincerity in his voice. Fear, too. "I don't know how to feel." Amara admitted. "Part of me is angry. Part of me is relieved." "That is fair," he said quietly. "I forfeited the right to easy forgiveness a long time ago." They sat in silence for a moment. "I will not interfere in your case," he added. "The law must run its course." "Thank you," Amara replied. "That matters to me." When the call ended, she rested her hand on her belly. "Looks like we have more family than we thought," she whispered to her child, a sad smile tugging at her lips. 3 days later, court resumed under Justice Ibrahim Lawal, a respected jurist from Masaba, known for his firm stance on ethics and impartiality. The courtroom filled again, quieter this time, more solemn. Justice Lawal wasted no time. "This court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case," he said. "But let it be clear, truth does not bend for emotion." Daniel Okoye was called back to the stand. Without Justice Adeyemi's presence, Daniel looked smaller somehow, exposed. "Mr. Okoye," Justice Lawal began, "you have admitted to concealing a lawful marriage, to withholding support, and to misleading another party." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord." "Why?" the judge asked. Daniel hesitated, then spoke with a voice stripped of confidence. "Because I thought I could manage everything," he said. "My image, my relationships. I thought money would soften consequences." "And did it?" Justice Lawal asked. Daniel swallowed. "No." The judge leaned forward. "You placed ambition above humanity," he said, "and the court finds that unacceptable." The prosecution moved next, introducing evidence of financial manipulation. Accounts Daniel had used to control Amara's access to funds, documents showing attempts to quietly move assets during the legal dispute. Vanessa watched in silence, her fingers twisting tightly in her lap. When she was called to testify again, her voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. I didn't know everything she said quietly, but I know now that I was wrong. Justice Lawal studied her carefully. Do you accept responsibility for the assault? He asked. Yes, Vanessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. I do. And do you understand that your actions endangered 2 lives? Tears slid down her cheeks. Yes. The courtroom remained silent, not sympathetic, but attentive. Then Amara was called. She stood slowly steadied by her lawyer's presence. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at Vanessa. She looked straight ahead. My lord, she said, I came into this court feeling invisible. I was told to hide, to be quiet, to accept less because it was convenient. She paused. I refuse to pass that lesson on to my child. Justice Lawal nodded. What do you seek from this court? He asked. Amara thought for a moment. Protection, she said, accountability, and the freedom to raise my child without fear. There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. Justice Lawal closed his file. This court has heard enough, he said. Judgment will be delivered shortly. As the session adjourned, Daniel remained seated staring at the floor. His empire, once solid, now trembled under the weight of truth. Vanessa was escorted out quietly. No cameras, no admirers. And Amara walked out into the sunlight, uncertain, exhausted, but no longer alone. Behind her, unseen but present, was a father trying to learn how to be one. And ahead of her was a future no longer shaped by silence. Judgment Day arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the city itself had paused to listen. The High Court of Enugu State was filled before sunrise, not with noise this time, but with quiet expectation. People sat closer together, shoulders touching eyes forward. They were no longer here for spectacle. They were here for resolution. Amara arrived early. She wore a soft blue dress loose around her belly, her hair neatly tied back. Her face showed fatigue, but also something new: resolve. Barrister Chinedu walked beside her, carrying a single file. No stacks of documents, no last-minute strategies. Truth had already been laid bare. Daniel Okoye arrived shortly after. He moved more slowly now, as if the weight of the past weeks pressed against his spine. The confident billionaire who once commanded rooms had become a man haunted by his own choices. Vanessa Mensah was brought in under escort. She no longer tried to appear powerful. Her designer clothes had been replaced by something simpler, almost deliberately so. Her eyes were rimmed with red. She looked smaller than she ever had. When Justice Ibrahim Lawal entered, everyone rose. He acknowledged the room briefly before taking his seat. This court, he began, has examined evidence of marriage deception, manipulation, financial control, and physical assault. His voice was calm but unyielding. This case exposed not only personal failures, he continued, but a dangerous belief that wealth and influence can rewrite truth. He paused. That belief is false. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Justice Lawal addressed him directly. Mr. Okoye, he said, you entered into a lawful marriage and then deliberately erased it. You withheld support from your pregnant wife, allowed public humiliation, and encouraged ambiguity that led to violence. Daniel closed his eyes. You are found in contempt of marital and parental responsibility, the judge said. The court orders immediate and sustained financial provision for Ms. Amara Okoye and her child, independent of your personal discretion. A murmur swept through the room. Furthermore, Justice Lawal continued, your attempt to conceal assets during proceedings constitutes bad faith. Daniel's lawyers exchanged glances. The court orders a full financial audit of Okoye Holdings in relation to spousal obligations, the judge declared. Non-compliance will invite criminal sanctions. Daniel's empire trembled visibly in that moment. Then the judge turned to Vanessa. Ms. Mensah, he said you entered this matter claiming deception. Evidence confirms that deception existed. Vanessa lifted her head slightly. But the judge continued, you chose entitlement over restraint. You chose aggression over law. He paused. For the assault of a pregnant woman within this courtroom, you are found guilty. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. The court sentences you to a custodial term, suspended on condition of compliance with anger management, public apology, and restitution, Justice Lawal said. Any further violation will activate immediate imprisonment. Vanessa's lips trembled. Tears slid freely now. Not performative, not dramatic, simply human. Yes, my lord, she whispered. Finally, the judge turned to Amara. Ms. Okoye, he said, his tone softening slightly, you came to this court seeking dignity, not revenge. Amara met his gaze. Yes, my lord. This court recognizes your restraint, he said, and your courage. He paused. The marriage between you and Mr. Okoye stands legally recognized. However, this court will not force emotional reconciliation. Amara's chest rose and fell slowly. You are granted full autonomy in decisions regarding separation, custody, and personal security. Justice Lawal concluded, the law will protect you. Silence filled the courtroom. Then the gavel struck. This court is adjourned. It was over. For a moment, no one moved. Then Amara felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Relief. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind, the quiet kind that settles into the bones after a storm has passed. Daniel remained seated long after others stood. His lawyers whispered, but he did not respond. He was staring at Amara, not with desire, not with authority, but with regret. When he finally stood, he approached her slowly. Amara, he said quietly, keeping a respectful distance. I was wrong. She looked at him calmly. I know, she replied. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, but I want to be present for the child. Amara placed a hand over her belly. Being present is not a promise, she said. It's a pattern. Daniel nodded slowly. I will learn, he said. She did not respond. She did not need to. Vanessa was escorted out soon after. As she passed Amara, she stopped briefly. I am sorry, Vanessa said, her voice low and unsteady. I let anger turn me into someone I don't recognize. Amara studied her face for a moment. I hope you find peace, she said gently, and learn from it. It was not forgiveness, but it was release. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. The crowd had thinned, but a few people remained watching quietly. A woman holding a baby nodded at Amara as she passed. A young man whispered, Stay strong. Amara breathed deeply. For the first time since this journey began, she felt like the ground beneath her feet was solid. Not because everything was fixed, but because the truth had finally stood tall. And somewhere behind the scenes, a man who had once worn a judge's robe waited patiently, not to claim authority, but to earn a place in the life he had almost lost forever. Life did not magically soften after the verdict. In fact, the days that followed felt strangely heavier for Amara, like the silence after a storm, when the world looks calm, but the body is still shaking from thunder. She returned to the quiet duplex in Enugu, now under legal protection. Security officers were stationed discreetly outside. The house, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a place of recovery. Still at night, sleep came in fragments. Her hand often rested on her belly, feeling her child move, reminding her that something good was still growing inside her despite everything. 3 days after the judgment, a message arrived through Barrister Chinedu. Justice Samuel Adeyemi requests a private meeting at your convenience. Amara read it several times. Her chest tightened. She had known this moment would come. Ever since the courtroom revelation, her mind had been filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. Anger lived beside curiosity. Pain stood next to longing. After a long pause, she replied, "Tomorrow afternoon. Neutral location." They met at a quiet garden cafe on the outskirts of the city. Open air. Simple wooden chairs. No reporters. No uniforms. Samuel Adeyemi arrived early, dressed plainly, no longer a judge in authority, but a man carrying the weight of years he could not undo. When Amara arrived, he stood instinctively. "You don't have to," she said softly. He nodded and sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Birds rustled in nearby trees. A breeze stirred the leaves. "I don't know how to start," Samuel finally said. Amara folded her hands over her belly. "Neither do I," she replied honestly. He took a slow breath. "I failed you," he said, "before you ever knew my name." The words landed heavy, but they were not explosive. They were quiet, mature, long overdue. "I believed lies," he continued. "I believed that power could protect reputation without destroying lives. When your mother disappeared, I told myself it was better not to dig." His voice trembled. "I was wrong." Amara's filled with tears she did not wipe away. "My mother used to cry at night," she said softly. "She never told me why. She just said some truths were buried by people who were afraid." Samuel lowered his head. "She deserved better," he said. "So did I." Amara replied not bitterly, but truthfully. Silence stretched between them. Then Samuel looked up. "I don't want to disrupt your life," he said. "I don't want to claim a title I haven't earned. I only want the chance to know you, if you allow it." Amara studied his face. She saw remorse, fear, hope, and something else. Patience. "I can't give you forgiveness yet," she said carefully, "but I can give you honesty." Samuel nodded. "That is more than I deserve." They spoke for over an hour about her childhood, about her mother, about his late wife, about the years lost to pride and silence. Not all wounds healed in that conversation, but something fragile began to form. Trust. Later that week, the DNA results arrived. Confirmed. Amara Okoye was Aisha Adeyemi's daughter, Samuel Adeyemi's child. When the envelope was opened, Samuel's hands shook. He did not celebrate. He wept. He wept for the daughter he lost once, and the granddaughter he would almost never meet. When he came to see Amara, with the result she was quiet. "So it's true?" she said. "Yes," he replied softly. She nodded slowly. "I need time," she said again. "I understand," he answered. That evening, Daniel Okoye requested a meeting. Amara hesitated, but agreed this time on her terms. They met at her lawyer's office. Daniel looked tired, smaller, less polished. "I've begun the audit," he said immediately, "and I've arranged the trust fund for the baby." Amara listened without interrupting. "I want to do better," Daniel added, "not because the court ordered but because I finally understand what I almost lost." Amara looked at him steadily. "You lost me a long time ago," she said calmly. "What matters now is what kind of father you choose to be." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "I will respect your boundaries," he said. That night, alone in her room, Amara sat by the window and reflected on how much had changed. She had walked into court as a hidden wife. She had walked out as a woman with a voice, a past reclaimed, and a future she could finally shape. Her phone buzzed with a message. From Samuel. "I planted a tree today for your mother and for you. Whenever you're ready, I'll show you." Amara placed her hand on her belly and smiled faintly. Maybe some roots, even when damaged, could still grow strong. And maybe, just maybe, the story of her family did not have to end in loss, but in healing. The weeks that followed unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a wound learning how to close. The city moved on as cities always do. Headlines faded. New scandals replaced old ones. But for the people at the center of the storm, life was still rearranging itself piece by fragile piece. For Vanessa Mensah, consequences arrived quietly. She complied with the court's orders, attended counseling sessions, issued a public apology that was shorter than expected and heavier than she anticipated. The cameras were gone. The applause never came back. At her first counseling session, she sat across from a therapist in a plain room with beige walls and no mirrors. "Why did you lose control?" the therapist asked gently. Vanessa stared at her hands. "Because I was afraid," she admitted after a long silence. "Afraid of being replaced. Afraid of being invisible." The words surprised her as she said them. She had built her entire identity around being seen, being chosen. And when that image cracked, rage rushed in to fill the fear. "I didn't think about the baby," Vanessa whispered. "I only thought about myself." That truth haunted her. She began to understand that ambition without empathy becomes entitlement, and entitlement, when threatened, turns violent. It was not an easy realization, but it was necessary. Across the city, Daniel Okoye faced his own reckoning. The audit was brutal. Transactions were frozen. Board members questioned decisions they had once ignored. For the first time in his career, Daniel sat in meetings where his voice did not dominate the room. He was forced to listen. And listening changed him. He met with his lawyers not to strategize control, but to ensure compliance. He set up a trust for the child, untouchable, transparent. He signed agreements granting Amara autonomy and protection without resistance. When he visited Amara's lawyer's office to finalize documents, he spoke quietly. "I spent years believing power was control," he said. "Now, I see its responsibility. Amara listened calmly. Responsibility is proven. Over time, she replied, not in words. Daniel nodded. I know, he said. I am prepared to wait. For Samuel, Adeyemi, waiting became a discipline. He did not call Amara every day. He did not intrude. He respected her boundaries the way he wished he had respected her mother's choices years ago. Instead, he showed up where it mattered. He attended prenatal seminars, not as a proud grandfather, but as a man learning what he had missed. He asked questions. He took notes. He listened to stories of expectant mothers and silent regrets of older fathers. He began volunteering at a legal aid clinic on weekends, quietly advising young women navigating custody battles and inheritance disputes. When one of them asked why he was there, he answered simply, because the law should protect the vulnerable first. One afternoon, Amara agreed to meet him again, this time at the park where he had planted the tree. It was young and slender leaves bright with promise. For my mother, Amara said softly, touching the bark. For you, Samuel replied. And for what comes next? They sat on a bench nearby. I still get angry, Amara admitted. Sometimes for no reason. Sometimes because I imagine how different things could have been. Samuel nodded. Anger is honest, he said, but it doesn't have to be permanent. She looked at him. Are you asking for forgiveness? He shook his head. No, he said. I'm asking for time. She considered that. Time she had learned could be cruel or healing. I can give you time, she said finally. Samuel's shoulders eased just a little. As Amara's pregnancy progressed, her body grew heavier, slower. Some days were bright and hopeful. Others were filled with sudden fear, memories of the courtroom, the fall, the cold floor beneath her. On one such evening, she woke from a nightmare breath, shallow hands trembling. She reached for her phone without thinking. Samuel answered on the second ring. I'm here, he said immediately. I don't know why I'm calling, she whispered. You don't need a reason, he replied. Tell me what you're feeling. And she did. She talked about fear, about becoming a mother, about the possibility of repeating mistakes she never chose. Samuel listened. You are not your past, he said gently. You are your choices, and every choice you've made so far has protected life. Tears slid silently down Amara's cheeks. In that moment, something shifted. Not forgiveness, but trust. Weeks later, Amara went into labor. It happened at dawn, quietly at first, then all at once. Barrister Chinedu drove her to the hospital. Daniel arrived shortly after, pacing the corridor, but keeping his distance. Samuel came last, hesitant, respectful, standing just outside the room. Hours passed. Pain rose and fell like waves. And then life. A cry pierced the room, strong and insistent. It's a boy, the nurse announced, smiling. Amara wept as they placed him on her chest. He was warm, real, alive. In that moment, every courtroom, every argument, every wound faded into the background. There was only breath and heartbeat. Later, when the room was quiet, Amara asked the nurse to let Samuel in. He stepped inside slowly, as if afraid to disturb the air. Amara looked up at him. Meet your grandson, she said. Samuel's knees nearly gave way. He approached the bed carefully, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny life cradled in Amara's arms. I promise, he whispered, voice breaking, to do better. For him, for you. Amara nodded. Outside the window, the morning sun rose soft, steady, forgiving. Not everything was repaired, but something had begun. And sometimes, beginnings are the most powerful form of justice. The world did not announce the beginning of Amara's new life with applause. There were no cameras outside the hospital when she was discharged. No headlines followed her home. Only quiet footsteps, careful breaths, and a small human being, wrapped in blue, sleeping against her chest. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt safe. Amara named her son Korede, a name her mother once loved, meaning the crown has arrived. She chose it not because of wealth or lineage, but because this child had survived where fear lies, and violence had tried to erase him. The first weeks were exhausting. Sleepless nights, aching muscles, moments of panic when Korede cried, and she didn't know why. Motherhood stripped away every illusion of control and replaced it with vulnerability and instinct. Daniel kept his distance just as he promised. He visited only when invited. He never stayed long. When he held Korede for the first time, his hands shook. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. Amara watched him closely. "Then learn," she said. "That's what real fathers do." Daniel nodded, humbled. He began attending parenting classes, not secretly, not through assistance, but openly. He listened more than he spoke. For a man who once believed leadership meant command, learning to follow was his greatest challenge. And slowly, he changed. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but genuinely. For Samuel Adeyemi, becoming a grandfather felt like stepping into a second chance he never believed he would be given. He did not try to correct the past with grand gestures. Instead, he showed up consistently. He cooked meals for Amara when she was too tired to stand. He read to Korede in a low, steady voice, even when the baby slept through every word. He fixed small things around the house quietly without announcing himself. One evening, as Amara watched him rock Korede gently, she felt something unexpected loosen inside her chest. Grief. Not the loud kind, the old kind. For a childhood that could have been different. Samuel noticed her silence. "I know I can't replace the years," he said softly. "But if you ever want to tell me about them, I will listen." Amara nodded, and she did. She told him about loneliness, about watching other children with fathers at school events, about learning to be strong too early, about her mother's quiet courage and unspoken sorrow. Samuel listened without interruption. When she finished, he said only one thing: "I am proud of the woman you became, not despite what you endured, but because you chose kindness anyway." That night, Amara slept deeply for the first time since the trial began. Vanessa Mensah watched the news of Korede's birth from a small apartment far from the spotlight she once chased. She did not reach out. She knew some doors closed permanently, but she continued therapy, continued reflection, continued rebuilding herself away from validation and applause. It was a quieter life, harder, but honest. One afternoon, she wrote a letter she never sent. "I confused being chosen with being worthy. I hurt someone because I didn't know how to sit with my own fear. I will spend the rest of my life learning better." She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Some apologies were not meant to be heard. They were meant to be lived. Months passed. Korede learned to smile, to recognize voices, to reach for faces he trusted. When Samuel entered the room, the baby's eyes followed him. When Amara sang softly, Kurede calmed instantly. Family, she realized, was not about blood alone. It was about presence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Amara sat on the veranda holding her son. Samuel watered the young tree in the yard, the one planted for her mother. Daniel stood nearby, watching quietly. "This is enough for me," Amara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Both men turned to her. "Peace," she continued. "Truth. A child who grows up knowing he was never hidden." Daniel swallowed. "I won't ask for more," he said. "Only the chance to be better than I was." Samuel nodded. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure silence never steals another truth in this family." Amara looked down at Korede, then back at them. "Then let's build something different," she said. "Not perfect, but honest." As night settled over Enugu, the house glowed softly from within. No luxury, no spectacle, just warmth, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of healing. The courtroom had delivered justice, but life delivered meaning. And in that meaning, Amara finally understood power does not come from wealth. It comes from integrity. Family is not defined by status. It is defined by who stays when staying is hard. And real hope is born, not when the world is fair, but when someone chooses to be good anyway. This story reminds us that true power is never found in money status or public applause. It is found in courage. The courage to tell the truth when silence feels safer. The courage to protect life when the world turns cruel. And the courage to take responsibility when mistakes can no longer be hidden. Amara's journey teaches us that dignity does not come from being chosen by powerful people, but from choosing integrity even when it costs everything. It shows us that injustice can live comfortably behind wealth, but truth has a way of rising slowly, painfully, yet inevitably. And above all, it reminds us that healing is possible, not by erasing the past, but by facing it with honesty and compassion. Family love and hope are not inherited through blood or privilege, but built through presence, accountability, and sacrifice. When we choose kindness over bitterness and truth over fear, we give the next generation a better beginning than the one we were given. What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. And if stories like this inspire you, please subscribe to the channel and walk this journey of meaningful storytelling with us.